Congress dragged Jasmine Crockett in to question her loyalty. Cameras rolled, lights blazed, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned and fired at Melania Trump, exposing a 23-year visa cover-up and a justice system that bows to beauty and money. If the law protects power instead of truth, what's left of America's justice? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing was not routine. It had been convened under a special summons by the Subcommittee for the Review of Exceptional Immigration Procedures, a body so rarely activated that its name alone sent shivers through Washington's inner circles. No press, no cameras, just closed doors and questions too dangerous for the public eye. The chamber was silent, heavy with tension, every seat filled, every eye watching. At the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, stone-faced, eyes down, fingers resting on a stack of documents like they were loaded weapons. Across from her sat Donald Trump, arms crossed, chin lifted in silent contempt. The nameplate in front of him read, "Mr. Trump, voluntary witness." But nothing about his presence felt voluntary. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He stared at Jasmine like he was waiting to crush something. The first strike came from a senator out of Florida, older, smirking, and dangerous in the way only those who think they'll never be challenged can be. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, dripping with arrogance, "before we dive into these allegations, perhaps we should establish something more fundamental." He looked around for silent backup. "Do you even understand what this country was built on? Do you understand what it means to earn America?" A few soft chuckles echoed behind him. "See, many of us here came from families who bled, who built, who sacrificed, not from neighborhoods that burned or begged for handouts." Jasmine didn't look up. She simply moved her pen half an inch to the left. The senator leaned forward. "You weren't raised in a legacy of American greatness. You were raised in resistance. That's different. That's dangerous." He let the sentence hang, ugly and proud. Another senator chimed in from the side, a woman with a rigid smile. "What my colleague means is, when someone like you speaks on immigration, it's important we know your allegiance isn't to activism, but to the flag." The insult was clean, rehearsed, and brutal. All eyes turned to Jasmine. Still no reaction. Still no words. Trump shifted in his seat, gave a quiet laugh, and muttered, "She doesn't even flinch. Typical." Then Jasmine slowly raised her head. Her voice was clear, calm, controlled. But what she said wasn't. "If we're really going to question who belongs here, maybe it's time we revisit how Mrs. Melania Trump got here in the first place." The room froze. Not metaphorically, literally. No one moved, no one breathed. Trump's jaw locked. The senator from Florida blinked twice, unsure if he heard her right. One of the aides dropped a pen. Trump snapped up in his chair. "Melania is a woman of grace. She loves this country more than anyone in this damn room, including you." His voice was sharp, rising, reckless. He jabbed a finger across the table toward Jasmine, heat radiating from his skin. "You come in here with your paperwork and your petty attacks and think you can smear the name of someone who's done nothing but represent America with class? You should be ashamed of yourself." Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even shift in her seat. Trump kept going. "Melania followed the law. She followed the process. Unlike others who whine about fairness while this country gives them everything." His words echoed like gunshots in the chamber. One senator tried to interrupt, but Trump waved him off. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, eyes locked on Trump. "Then you won't mind if we take a closer look at the details." Her voice sliced through the air like a cold blade. Trump opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The silence returned, this time heavier, because everyone in that room, including Donald Trump, knew that what was coming next wouldn't be just another political jab. It would be a detonation. And just when the silence threatened to collapse under its own weight, the next voice came like a slap across the face. Loud, defensive, and furious. "Are you seriously accusing the former First Lady of fraud?" a senator snapped, his voice bouncing off the marble walls like a gavel made of thunder. His chair scraped back as he stood, red-faced and trembling with indignation. "This is outrageous. This is beneath the dignity of this chamber." The room flinched. Every eye snapped toward Jasmine, half expecting her to stumble, to back down, to clarify. But she didn't even blink. The man's voice cracked under the weight of his own rage, and still Jasmine sat there, like a wall of steel, unshaken and unimpressed. Her hand moved slowly, reaching down beside her chair, unlocking the leather straps of the case that had sat unopened for over an hour. She placed it on the table, flipped it open with care, and pulled out a thick folder sealed in crimson wax. The moment the envelope hit the wood, it let out a sound. Not loud, but deliberate. A sound that said, "This isn't hearsay. This is evidence." "This is the 2000 visa application file for Melania Naus," Jasmine said, her voice razor flat, emotionless but deadly. "Inside is a formal request for reconsideration, dated 6 months later. It raises concern that she engaged in unauthorized work, specifically modeling gigs, before receiving legal work authorization." The temperature in the room dropped. No one dared to move. Her delivery wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that rearranges oxygen. Jasmine didn't look for applause. She didn't dramatize. She just let the words sink into every seat, every suit, every silence. Then methodically, she pulled out copies. Clean, indexed, labeled. One by one, she placed them on the table in front of each committee member like she was laying out exhibits in a criminal trial. There was no flourish, no smugness, no showmanship, just precision, like a surgeon, not a politician. As the folders were passed around, a visible shift cracked through the room. Faces that once smirked now stiffened. Eyes that were once locked on Jasmine now fell to the documents in front of them. One senator, a woman from the minority party, leaned in close to her neighbor and whispered, barely audible, "Is this real?" Her hands trembled slightly as she turned a page. There was no answer. Just breath held like a collective inhalation before a storm. Then a noise from across the room. Trump scoffing. He leaned back in his chair like the king of nothing, raising a brow with theatrical boredom. "Old paperwork," he muttered. "Outdated garbage. I've paid millions in taxes, probably more than everyone in this room combined. And what have you done, Congresswoman, other than grandstand and stir chaos?" His voice slithered through the chamber, coated in sarcasm and superiority. The moment wasn't about the facts anymore. He was trying to drag it into a fight, to bait her into emotion, into overreach, into losing control. He thought arrogance was still his armor. He thought wealth still meant immunity. He smirked like he'd just pulled the rug out from under her. Jasmine didn't take the bait, not even close. "I've helped 137 people avoid deportation over typos and missed appointments," she said, her tone still cold, still level. "People who didn't have lawyers, people who didn't have names anyone cared about." She turned her face toward him now, eyes like steel. "People who would have been thrown out for far less than what's in that file." That sentence didn't echo. It landed. Trump's face stiffened. He sat forward but didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. For once, the man who never stopped talking had nothing to say. Around him, lawmakers continued flipping through the pages, but no one made a sound. The room, moments ago, filled with heat and fury, now sat on the edge of something deeper. Not anger, but fear. Because Jasmine hadn't just brought a folder. She'd brought a mirror, and one by one, the people in that chamber were being forced to look at themselves in it. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not by a mile. What she dropped on that table was just the match. Now she was about to strike it. With calm, deliberate movement, Jasmine leaned forward, flipped open the folder marked Exhibit 4B, and pulled one page closer with the tip of her pen. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved like they had rehearsed this moment in silence, over and over, waiting for the exact second it would matter most. The page made a soft scratch as it turned under her hand, but to those watching, it sounded like a fuse being lit. She tapped once on a highlighted line near the bottom, then turned it slightly so the nearest committee members could read it for themselves. Her voice cut clean through the tension. June 12th, 2000, she said, her tone sharp. Not loud, but loud enough. That's the day stamped on the official work authorization process, which for the record was still pending. The air changed again, this time heavier. Jasmine didn't pause. And yet, on that exact day, Mrs. Melania Naus walked a runway in Manhattan as the commercial face of a European fashion brand, in front of a crowd of sponsors, press and clients, a paid engagement under federal law. You could almost hear the room blink. A few people leaned forward involuntarily, others froze. The timeline wasn't vague. It wasn't theoretical. It was a surgical strike. She kept going, cool, unshaken, which for those unfamiliar with H-1B conditions is considered unauthorized employment. Then it happened, a sharp clatter near the back of the chamber. The immigration lawyer seated behind the Republican bench dropped his glasses. He reached down to grab them, but his face had already said what his mouth couldn't. Jasmine wasn't bluffing. No one laughed, no one smiled. The tension had sharpened into something more dangerous. Consequence. One senator swallowed so hard it echoed through the microphone. Then came the interruption. "You're digging up old history for no reason," a Trump-aligned committee member snapped, his voice rising with just enough desperation to sound like deflection. "You're not proving anything. You're just weaponizing paperwork because you hold a grudge." His tone shook. He tried to spin it with a smirk, but it cracked halfway through. The room didn't follow him. No one defended the line. Not even the people who usually did. Jasmine turned her head just slightly, just enough to meet him in the eye. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it was fatal. "If a Latinx college student gets deported for working 12 hours at a diner," she said, "then why is a model in a $5,000 Louis Vuitton dress immune?" The weight of the sentence hit like stone dropped in the still water. No reaction, no rebuttal, just a ripple of shifting eyes, clenched jaws, and clenched fists under the table. The sentence was too clean, too real, too undeniable. It was the kind of truth people pretend they haven't heard, just so they won't be responsible for what comes next. And in that moment, Jasmine hadn't just delivered a comparison, she had delivered an indictment of the system. One line, and the room buckled under it. Trump snapped. "You're attacking women. Beautiful women, is that it? You're jealous, huh?" His voice boomed with deflection, not confidence. A man grasping for his old tricks, even as they failed him in real time. He didn't even look at Jasmine when he said it. He looked past her, to the faces that used to nod at everything he said. This time none did. Not one. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to signal what was coming next. And then she said it, slowly, like a hammer driving a nail through marble. "Not everyone gets to break the law wearing a $5,000 dress." The line dropped like a dead body in the middle of the room. It didn't bounce. It didn't echo. It just landed, and everything changed. One half of the committee lowered their eyes, not out of respect, but out of shame. The other half stared forward, motionless, trembling with fury they couldn't articulate. No one answered her. No one could, because no matter how much they wanted to spin it, the question was still hanging in the air, and it wasn't going anywhere. Trump slammed his palm against the polished desk, not enough to shake it, but enough to demand attention. His voice sharpened with every syllable, desperation masked as indignation. "Melania married me, First Lady. You want to tear her down, you'll have to tear down America too." The line echoed off the walls like a pre-written slogan, more theater than truth. But no one clapped. No one seconded him. A few senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Trump's tone tried to invoke patriotism, but it landed as panic. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was recoil. Across from him, Jasmine didn't even blink. No smirk, no sigh, just an unshaken calm that made his outburst look small. And then, like a scalpel slicing through fabric, she leaned forward and dropped the temperature of the room. "She got married. But what about the thousands of mothers forced to leave this country because of a typo?" The words didn't explode. They cut, every syllable wrapped in quiet rage, not loud but impossible to ignore. She reached down and pulled a worn case file from the bottom of her brief. The folder was tattered, not for effect, but because it had passed through too many hands. ICE officers, attorneys, detention clerks. Dallas, 2003, Jasmine began, placing the file in the middle of the table like a loaded charge. Mother of three, worked nights at a hotel laundry, days cleaning offices, paid her taxes, filed her green card renewal form herself, but she put one wrong digit in the zip code box. The room seemed to hold its breath. They came at 4:00 a.m. Her youngest was still in pajamas. No translator, no lawyer, no second chance. Jasmine's voice dropped, slower, heavier. She was gone before sunrise. No press, no speech, no protection. Her hand hovered over the folder like it still burned. And she didn't have a billionaire to marry her out of the system. No one moved. Even the senators who had backed Trump earlier now stared into nothing. Eyes distant, lips pursed. The silence was thick, not just in the air, but in their throats. One aide at the back quietly lowered his notepad. The sound of the HVAC system overhead was suddenly loud, humming, gasping, like even the building knew the weight of what had just been exposed. Jasmine didn't need to say anything else. The file on the table did all the screaming for her. The room had already been simmering, tension thick enough to chew through. But what Jasmine did next turned that simmer into a silent boil. Without fanfare, she reached into her folder again, her hand moving slowly, deliberately, as if pulling the pin from a grenade. From inside, she retrieved a worn government file. Not flashy, not loud, just aged paper with a quiet kind of menace. She held it up briefly, letting every eye in the room catch the stark contrast of the black ink burned across the top. Then she placed it on the desk with surgical precision, directly in the committee's line of sight. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It sliced clean through the air. This is an official record. Part of Mrs. Trump's immigration file. It was altered, not in error, not by accident, but deliberately. She tapped the bottom of the page, where the original visa details blurred into a second layer of printing. This revision was processed in 2006, she added, her tone ice cold, while Melania was already serving as First Lady of the United States. Then came the hammer, a faint line beneath the print, handwritten, nearly erased by time, but still visible. Handle internally under special exemption. The phrase was so clinical, it felt like a death sentence dressed in a suit. A few senators leaned forward, squinting, their eyes bouncing between the text and Jasmine's steady hand. The room didn't breathe. A legal advisor at the edge of the table shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to disappear. That single black stamp said everything no one wanted said out loud. The system had bent, not for justice, not for mercy, but for power. Jasmine didn't need to explain it. She just let the document sit there, radiating quiet destruction. Trump didn't process it right away. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, lips parted, gaze locked on the page like it was written in fire. Then his entire body snapped to life. He slammed his fists against the table, his chair flying backward with a crash. "That's fake news. I'm suing you." His voice cracked on the last syllable. Not fury, fear, not dominance, desperation. The chairman instinctively reached for the gavel and banged it hard. "Mr. Trump, sit down. This is not your stage." But Trump wasn't sitting. He was unraveling. "Melania has never done anything wrong. You, Crockett, you're just a destroyer." His words spilled like gasoline, wild and unfocused. But no one reached out to stop Jasmine. No one tried to silence her. Her eyes never left Trump. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. Because the truth, stamped in black ink and dated in power, was already louder than anything he could scream. The weight of the prior exchange still lingered like smoke from a controlled detonation, but Jasmine wasn't finished. Not until she struck the final chord that had been waiting in silence for over 2 decades. Slowly and without flourish, she reached into the inner lining of her case and removed a small black USB drive, its surface matte, unmarked, and cold like the quiet fury that had built within her over years of watching the powerful rewrite the rules for themselves. No one spoke as she stood, walked toward the evidence terminal, and inserted the USB. The screen remained blank. No slideshow, no theatrics. just a single audio file waiting to be opened. She paused, looked toward the committee, then toward Trump, whose eyes followed her, no longer burning with contempt, but flickering with something dangerously close to fear. "I have here," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering, "a recording from 2001, a radio interview conducted in Ljubljana, Slovenia. It features Mrs. Melania Trump in her own voice, describing the nature of her early work in the United States while her immigration paperwork was still, in her words, pending." There was a soundless shift in the air, as if the walls themselves were drawing closer. Jasmine clicked play. The voice emerged, soft and distinct, bearing that unmistakable European cadence, elegant yet damning in its candor. "Sometimes you work because you have to, even if paper's not ready yet. You smile, you pose, you send money home. This is life." There was no need to explain the context. The words were raw, casual, and irrefutable. Melania Trump had not been coerced. She had not been trapped. She had simply chosen to accept work before receiving legal authorization, an act for which tens of thousands of immigrants had been penalized, deported, and publicly shamed. The room was frozen. At that time, I was waiting for paper, but I already had modeling offer in New York. It was very good chance, very good pay. I said yes. Jasmine didn't look at anyone while the audio played. She didn't need to. Every head in the chamber was already fixed on the invisible specter of Melania's voice, echoing off marble walls and into the official record of the United States government. One legal advisor whispered something to the senator beside him, but the words evaporated before they left his lips. Another aide instinctively reached for a pen, then stopped, unsure if writing anything would even matter anymore. "I do not think it is bad. Many girls do it. You come to America, you work hard. That is what we are told." Then silence. Not the awkward silence of a misstep, but the kind that happens when something undeniable has just cut through pretense like a scalpel through silk. Jasmine let the moment settle, allowed the full gravity of the recording to finish what no cross-examination could. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She merely turned back to her seat, closed the laptop with care, and folded her hands. Across from her, Donald Trump, once loud, volatile, and unshakable, was now motionless, his shoulders slightly slumped, his fists unclenched. For the first time all day, he looked down. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to, because the most powerful man in the room had finally said nothing, and the silence that followed, thick, reverent, and final, was louder than anything he could have screamed. When the recording ceased, the silence that followed wasn't merely absence of sound. It was gravity, settling around every soul in that chamber. It thickened and settled like smoke after fire, erasing lingering echoes and replacing them with stillness so absolute you could almost feel your pulse slow in fear. The overhead lights glowed sterilely, but even they seemed dimmer now, as if recoiling from what had just transpired. No one dared exhale. Senators, aides, staff, even security officers, all looked inward, as though the room itself had become a crucible. The screen displayed nothing. The playback window vanished. The only audible signal was the faint hum of the air conditioning system, which now sounded intrusive, uncomfortably loud, as if embarrassed by the weight of what had been revealed. Every chair remained locked in place. Every pen paused. Every breath held. Then finally the chair moved. Not hastily, not loudly, but with measured gravity. The gentle flick of her fingers across the desk cut through the tension with surgical precision. She leaned forward, unplugged the USB from the terminal, and held it for a moment, its black matte surface nearly glowing under the harsh lights, heavy with unsaid consequences. Without letting her eyes deviate from the committee's gaze, she carefully placed the drive into a red-sealed evidence pouch, as though tucking away a confession that could not be undone. She did not speak. She did not demand applause. She did not provide commentary. She simply nodded, once firmly, signaling the hearing's closure with understated authority. Jasmine Crockett remained seated a beat longer. She didn't rise immediately. Instead, she allowed a beat of silence to stretch, measured, intentional. Her back remained rigid, spine erect, conveying quiet confidence in the face of the storm she'd just unleashed. Her hands lay flat on the table, clasped and still, like twin anchors holding her through the aftershocks. She did not glance around. She did not scan friendly faces or gloat at the stunned reactions across the table. Not once did she offer a closing line, a final flourish, or a declarative statement of triumph. She simply collapsed her binder with calm precision, stacking each sheet in order as though she'd just placed the final cornerstone in a wall that couldn't be knocked down. One by one, she gathered her documents, each page pressed flat, each folder placed with deliberate care. There was not a scrap of arrogance in her movement. Instead, there was a quiet finality, as though closing a case file on injustice itself. The ambient lighting in the room seemed to dim subtly, light absorbed by the memory of what had just been revealed, as though the building itself was stunned. Donald Trump, seated across from her, did not move. His frame slumped fractionally, the only visible sign that he'd been unmoored. His fists unclenched. His gaze dropped. Not in shame, he was incapable of shame, but in stunned realization that some truths cannot be shouted into oblivion. No camera flashed, no phone cameras clicked. The prohibition on recording equipment at the beginning of the hearing had been absolute, and now that absence spoke louder than any image ever could. Press photographers, radio mics, recording devices, pool camera crews, they had been barred at the door. But truth had captured itself anyway, etched into the minds of every witness and attendee. Reality had been illuminated without visuals. The hearing's final scene would live on, not in headlines or viral clips, but in the quiet resolve of memory, in the internal transcripts of those present, in the word of mouth that would ripple outward. At last, Jasmine stood. Her rise was not timid, not hesitant, not prideful. It was graceful, measured, and deliberate. One fluid motion from seat to standing posture, a physical punctuation at the end of a sentence only she could construct. No applause followed, no cheering. The chamber remained suspended in silence as those assembled watched her rise. She allowed her weight to redirect gracefully, rising from the chair with dignity. Each step toward the exit felt like the closing of a chapter. Weighty, definite, unarguable. As she walked down the center aisle toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber, her heels clicked against marble, echoing in the hushed room like a final gavel strike. The sound was crisp, sharp, unyielding. Not one person followed her path. Not a single whisper was uttered. She did not look back. She did not turn to take victory bows. She merely exited, head high, expression calm, stride unwavering. Behind her, the room felt frozen in time. Trump did not rise. His head remained bowed. He did not watch her leave. In that moment, he was as still as the dust motes floating in the pale line of sunlight across the marble floor. No aide approached him. No senator sought reassurance. No one clapped him on the shoulder, because applause would have broken the spell. That was not the end. The end had already passed. When the heavy doors slid shut behind Jasmine, a collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room, but it was silent, internal, as though structure itself had breathed out a burden it had been forced to hold. The only movement was the slow, delicate lift of the chairman's hand from the evidence pouch, signaling the official adjournment. No words, just a gesture. No, thank you. No, you have a right to remain silent. Just a final nod to the gravity of everything that had transpired. An aide slowly rose to close the folder on the terminal. Senators began tapping their pens. Legal counsel started swiping notes and folders. The hush shattered, not in sound, but in the tremor of returning action, of minds moving through shock to processing. They straightened their posture, collected their binders, stood and exited one by one. But there was no chatter, no debate. The energy had shifted from spectacle to weight, from drama to lasting implication. Jasmine had not said another word. She didn't need to. That single nod, followed by her quiet departure, conveyed more authority than any closing statement could have. The hearing had ended, but the moment had not ceased. It would persist, in corridors, in committees, in whispered questions behind closed doors. Because silence had spoken more effectively than 1,000 speeches. And Trump's downfall had come not from shouting louder, but from finally being rendered speechless in the face of truth. Once Jasmine Crockett had exited the chamber, leaving the heavy doors closed behind her, The atmosphere inside the Capitol did not settle. It evolved. What happened in that hearing room did not vanish. It radiated outward through corridors, offices, and private hallways like an invisible pulse. Silence persisted, but underneath it, something else stirred. Curiosity, dread, and a growing sense that a secret was breaking free. A secret could not be forced back into its container once spoken, once recorded. The hush became tense, not empty, a tautness that made breaths catch and whispers amplify across wings of governance. It began unexpectedly. Someone noticed a photocopy lying on the floor outside an aide's office. Another noticed a sheet sticking out of someone else's briefcase in the subway car. A scanned visa application, Melania Trump's H-1B file, circulated quietly, not by email blast, not by clerk posting, but hand to hand, folder to folder, notebook to note. There was no formal announcement of its existence, no press release, no headline. It was simply there, an unmarked document that held more weight than any press briefing ever could. The visa form showed an odd notation, a red underline, a margin note in black ink implying internal exemption. It was the same document that had been featured in the hearing. Now it was circulating inside the building, where every office turned to glance at it when no one was watching. Staff across committee offices found copies slipped inside policy brief packets labeled for immigration reform. Others discovered them tucked into the spine of legislative binders in staff libraries. One first-hand account involved the file resting on an unsecured printer tray in the basement, clearly left behind by someone who dared not take it further. Before long, the rumor had legs. The document was everywhere, but nobody openly acknowledged it. It spread in the same way that a virus spreads: close contact, quick pass, untraceable path. No one admitted to possessing the file, but everyone started acting like they knew what it contained. The most senior staffers began speaking in hushed tones, referencing that file, using euphemisms rather than names. Senators asked aides about the visa issue in quiet corners. Legislative assistants paused mid-sentence, eyes wide, when asked about committee memos. Interns mapped secret routes through administrative wings to avoid running into someone carrying the document. The culture shifted. Offices required visitors to enter and exit with purpose, not lingering. People stopped sharing meal breaks. Conversational snippets evolved into code. Susan saw something you might want to see, or don't check the printer on 2B. Someone dropped it there. And everyone knew what it referred to. This internal leak didn't spark confrontation. It sparked paranoia. Chairs of subcommittees exchanged worried glances during lunch orders. A senior legal counsel said to a junior staffer, "Don't upload anything to intranet. That file is toxic." Another whispered that some aides were already deleting meeting attachments. And yet, despite the tension, the file didn't disappear. It moved silently. It wasn't hidden in secure vaults, but in plain sight. Every copy was subtly different. Some had stamps, some had annotations in pencil, some had margins smudged with fingerprints, proof not of chaos, but of multiple carriers passing it on. No firm confirmation ever came. No official source identified the leak. No press statement said the file had circulated internally, but whispers identify themselves. Eventually, staff in the adjoining halls knew not just that the file existed, but what it implied: power-bending rules, privilege overriding procedure, and a chilling disparity between the enforcement of legal status. Juniors told seniors they had seen documents. Seniors told juniors not to mention names. The rumor became legend in real time. Someone in the cloakroom joked, "Melania's visa file is popping up more than subpoenas." Another assistant posted a sticky note on his desk: "If this thing goes public, shut it all down." Meanwhile, the most cautious of staffers printed duplicate reports labeled miscellaneous just to avoid open discussions. The weight of knowledge felt like a live wire. Touch it, and it might spark. Ignore it, and it still crackled. Despite all this movement, no cameras clicked, no emails pinged, no chaos erupted. It stayed secret. The Capitol's bareness extended into boardrooms and offices alike. Yet if you listened closely, you heard it in silence. The sound of papers turning, eyes darting, chairs shifting away from doors. This invisible scandal had a heartbeat. The file had become not evidence alone, but a symbol of selective justice. It represented the question Jasmine had posed. If they take mothers away for a typo, why does the record stand silent when a First Lady's file is marked exempt? Staffers printed copies and bound them with innocuous covers labeled infrastructure projects, budget margins, or press clippings. It functioned as an internal intelligence leak, astonishingly effective without any official outlet. Rumors circulated that on the Senate floor, aides exchanged glances during cloture votes, momentarily remembering the document. Some said the file had been referenced in closed-door caucus meetings. Others mentioned that the chief of staff to a senior senator quietly made printed copies for personal review, though none publicly confirmed why. Conversations about new immigration checks, same standard enforcement, and future accountability suddenly became more pointed. The narrative had shifted from policy to possibility, to questioning why some rules were enforced and others silently waived. A few even said the file was being passed between partisan staffers, not in solidarity, but in discomfort, each thinking, if it happens to her, it can happen to anyone. The most whispered joke inside the corridors. We never thought they'd dare slip in ink. Now we live by it. And yet no one dared speak the truth aloud. No senator stood up and asked about it in session. No press brief resulted. But every so often, from behind closed door, someone would call another staffer and ask, "Have you seen it yet?" The answer, even unspoken, confirmed that the rumor had roots beneath the surface. Truly, the visa scan had not just circulated, it had burrowed itself into bureaucratic memory. Long after Jasmine left, years after dates moved on, the shredded rumor persisted. It became part of the Capitol's internal lore. Not a headline, but a silent reminder that even the most controlled hearings have echoes. And some echoes won't fade. Because in the end, it wasn't about who leaked the document. It was about who had to look at it. And anyone who did, even briefly, knew too much to ignore it. After the hearing ended and the doors slammed shut behind Jasmine, the Capitol faded into an uneasy quiet. There was no press release, no orchestrated exit, but the reverberations spread quickly through the corridors. What she had done wasn't just legal, it was seismic. In a narrow seminar room tucked into Georgetown Law's quietest wing, Jasmine Crockett took her seat at the head of a long oak table. The walls bore no portraits of presidents, just students in chairs, leaning forward as if gravity itself might push them toward truth. Evening light filtered through blinds, casting striped patterns on notebooks that stayed unturned. No cameras, no staffers, no firm expectations. Just law students who had signed up for a lesson in something far bigger than legislation. Jasmine's binder lay open before her, but she never reached for pen or slide deck. Her presence alone filled the room more fully than any PowerPoint ever could. "Not everyone who violates a law is a bad person," she began, her voice level, unhurried but not gentle. Her words weren't polished, there was no script, but their weight lingered. A few students paused mid-scribble. A couple nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of cost. The sentence was not a lesson, but a mirror. Jasmine looked into the faces of future immigration attorneys. They leaned in. She didn't need to raise her voice. No one blinked. "But if the law only applies to the powerless," she continued, pausing to let the space speak, "then it ceases to be a rule of justice. It becomes a tool of power." A hush fell, as if someone had pulled the plug on sound. Students sensed the gravity of what she'd said. Not policy, not statutes, but principle. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, hands clasped, her gaze locked with theirs. There was no theatrical flourish, no podium flourish, just truth laid bare in a moment of stillness. The most senior professor in the room, who had arranged the meeting, was still seated at the side. Her eyes narrowed slightly, indicating approval. Not of what was being taught, but of what was happening. Jasmine's presence commanded. "You will be assigned to enforce laws," she said in the same calm tone, "to verify documents, manage filings, defend hypotheticals in the presence of lawmakers, and it will feel bureaucratic, rote, until it doesn't." She paused. Her words changed tenor. "Because on the other end of those files are people arriving with hope and fear. Parents holding 4 pieces of paper in a language they barely understand. Not everyone gets to be called First Lady, even when they comply. Heads bowed. Some students looked to each other, acknowledging the magnitude of her message. Even low light caught the tension in the professor's jaw. Jasmine's tone didn't rise. It just carried. One student, visibly moved, swallowed and breathed. Another tapped out a phrase on their phone. A third folded their hands tighter, as if determination had entered their muscle memory. This wasn't a lecture. It was a transfer of responsibility, a quiet testament, a spark. She leaned back slightly. The narrative shifted quietly. You saw what happened in that hearing. You heard the recording. You know the standoff. Melania wasn't deported, and nothing changed for her. Not even questions. Why is that? Because she married power. Because she existed in a system built to shield some and exclude others. The statement wasn't accusation. It was exposition, a framing, a line in the sand. Another student, soft-spoken, asked, "What do we do now, Congresswoman?" Jasmine's eyes flickered with resolve. You build systems that are blind to status. You defend the undocumented student who cannot afford paperwork, the migrant farm worker whose zip code is flagged, woman, brown, black, undocumented, who could lose everything over syntax. Because these are not policy errors. They are structural corrections we must make. She finished, held that moment, let the silence resonate. 22 future attorneys heard it, not in sound, but in surrender to truth. No turnout, no Trump shouted, just Jasmine's simple call, act when law fails its people. Somehow the most dynamic lesson they'd ever had came without urgency, but with force. Its gravity was immovable. She rose at last. No higher voice, no grand ending, just control, just calm. She gathered her notes, zipped her briefcase, and stood. Her departure was quiet. Doors clicked. Light shifted. Students watched. They didn't follow. She didn't look back. And when the door closed behind her, it wasn't silence. It was promise. At the table remained 22 people changed by someone who dared to show them what courage looks like in law school. Not just burning statements, but moral clarity. Not applause. Not crescendo. Just a quiet revolution in a room unmarked by cameras, but indelible in conviction. The echo of Jasmine's round table lingered far beyond that room. It transformed the narrative, not by headlines, but by principle. And as the Capitol and the country digested it, something unexpected happened next. Across immigration law clinics at universities from Harvard to UCLA, professors paused their lessons to introduce a single question, a question no longer about Melania, the person, but about Melania as precedent. That question, does the law bend differently for some, was not theoretical anymore. It became a cornerstone of discussion in classrooms that had previously focused strictly on statutes, procedures, and administrative code. Professors projected the scanned visa file and the timeline. Students traced the dates. They compared zip code errors that cost immigrants their status with one file that had apparently been handled internally. Suddenly, case law was not just about legality, it was about inequality. Legal educators hadn't planned to pivot their curriculum mid-semester. But the moment Jasmine had exposed Melania's record and revealed the narrative behind it, it upended how educators frame fairness. The question evolved, are laws equally enforced or selectively applied? Seminar rooms buzzed with debate. Whiteboard paragraphs read, "Equal protection under the law is meaningless if enforcement is selective." Graduate seminars turned panels into pseudo-hearings. Professors asked, if an undocumented mother loses status for a typo, why does an application with a red ink note pass? Moot courts argued with unusual intensity. Even seasoned immigration law scholars found themselves defending not statute interpretation, but moral accountability. Among second-year students, the conversation deepened further. They started writing essays titled "The Melania File," analyzing privilege in immigration enforcement. Others published op-eds in student journals that had never run anything about first ladies before. One student's article, "When Courtesy Meets the Court," won a national legal writing prize. Clinics that usually served only low-income clients found unexpected visitors, students who had class assignments to observe actual open deportation hearings. They began volunteering, observing the contrast between who gets arrested and who remains untouched. In faculty lounges, rival professors exchanged quiet looks and confidential drafts of lecture slides. A famous constitutional law professor joked, "I never thought I'd teach a Melania lecture, but here we are, analyzing federal discretion from a former model's immigration file." Another responded, "If we don't frame it now, the public won't connect the dots." The academic echo chamber became a force multiplier, and the scandal that was once dismissed in headlines had become clinical, required reading, even in mainstream courses on administrative due process. Course catalogs were updated, new offerings appeared, selective enforcement and social equity, immigration privacy and privilege, course numbers flashing in red ink alongside former code index subjects like forms and fees. Professors assigned the Washington Post again and again, not as news but as source material. Survey classes dissected press coverage versus court records. Students were taught to list, issue spot first, check enforcement disparity second. The moment had reshuffled academic priorities and legal values. Melania's case was no longer a scandal story. It was case law in the making. At ethics panels across the country, ACLU chapters, state bar education sessions, the Melania question came up first. Lawyers asked, if elite individuals can get exemptions, what does that mean for rule of law? The answer echoed across venues. Privilege becomes immunity when rules bend for the wealthy. Young attorneys in the audience scribbled notes. Enforcement must be blind. Lawyers must not be blind. The legal zeitgeist was shifting. Jasmine's truth had triggered not just outrage, but structural critique. And so the question once framed as scandal, cynicism, or gossip had flipped. It was no longer, did Melania violate visa rules? The new framing, why are some records concealed when others are weaponized? This reframing became the first slide in thousands of jailhouse clinics, deportation defense workshops, pro bono initiatives. That violation of process became a rallying cry, not for politics, but for proportional justice. Students from across the ideological spectrum agreed, laws unenforced equally are not laws, they are instruments. Court clerk rooms buzzed when clerks overheard, I saw the memo, visa notes marked exempt, red-inked, and processed quietly. Law students interning saw docket entries flagged in ways that mirrored the Melania timeline. One young clerk whispered, if that file matters, so should every file about the rest of us. The question had democratized. It had lost its power to shame only a high-profile figure and gained the power to reveal a system. Even judges started referencing it in non-public memoranda about discretionary grants. That moment, Jasmine's question had become precedent before it had become law. It reverberated not from a court opinion, but from pockets of students carrying copies of visa scans. It echoed when immigrants got sent back for clerical errors, while wealthier applicants quietly dissolved in fractions. It spread quietly, but carried weight heavier than press tweets. And professors across 50 states adjusted final exam questions to ask, if your client is deported for a typographical error, what do you do when someone else's file bears special handling? And each time that question resounded, it reframed something bigger. Not just immigration rules, but American ideals. Because if the rule book only applies to some, then those laws do not protect, they oppress. And what began as a scandal had become a catalyst for reform, discussions, and moral realignment, from classrooms to courtrooms, from clinics to city halls. By then, the shockwaves had passed through every office, every chamber, every circle of power. The tape had not been leaked, but the silence Trump left behind was louder than any denial. The nation was holding its breath, and so was the press. The interview wasn't scheduled for prime time. There were no lights blinding her, no audience waiting for a punchline. It was a quiet room inside a legal clinic not far from Capitol Hill, filled with dusty law textbooks, mismatched chairs, and a single camera borrowed from a university media lab. Jasmine Crockett sat in a simple navy jacket, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The air was still. The only noise came from a small humming fridge in the corner. It was the kind of silence that demanded precision, not performance. Across from her sat a young journalist, not from a major network, but from a policy-based nonprofit that had earned credibility for one thing, asking the questions no one else dared to. He wasn't aggressive, just sharp, thoughtful. And when the interview began, he skipped the small talk. No questions about the viral footage, no bait for headlines. He leaned forward, voice low, and asked the one thing the public had started whispering since the hearing ended. Do you regret it? For a beat, Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need time to think. She needed space, for the weight of the question to settle where it belonged. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her hands didn't twitch. She took one slow breath, looked directly at the interviewer, and spoke with a voice that sounded more like a verdict than an answer. I didn't make noise. I just asked the one question people were too afraid to whisper. It was quiet after that. Not awkward, not empty, just complete, like nothing else needed to be said. The young man blinked twice. His pen froze above the notepad. The camera kept rolling, catching everything. But Jasmine offered no elaboration. She didn't fidget. She didn't explain. She just let the truth sit there, sharp as glass and just as clear. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't political. It was surgical. The kind of answer you don't follow up. Not because you're done asking, but because you realize you're the one being answered. Her words hit with more force than any accusation ever could. Because they weren't framed in fury. They were framed in fact. She hadn't exposed a family. She had exposed a system in the quiet comfort that protected it. That made her answer not only unsettling, but unshakable. The silence in the room was profound. The young reporter, now visibly shaken by the gravity of what had just been said, tried to continue. Do you think the country understands what you were really doing in that chamber? He asked softly, but Jasmine only tilted her head. Her expression didn't change. Her eyes stayed calm. That's for the country to decide, she said. My job wasn't to convince, it was to reveal. In the hallway outside the room, one of the legal interns who'd helped prepare the visa files stood frozen near the door. She whispered under her breath. She didn't raise her voice, but it shook the floor. And that sentiment was already spreading across law schools, legal podcasts, advocacy forums. The quote had started appearing on digital chalkboards in classrooms. Professors began referencing the moment as a case study in courage and clarity. I didn't make noise, they'd repeat aloud, writing it on whiteboards. I asked the one question. Some students didn't even need the full quote. They just said the question, and everyone knew what they meant. It had become a lesson, a challenge, a dare, wrapped in 9 words. Students who'd never seen themselves as political suddenly saw their silence as complicity. They were learning that law wasn't just about procedure, it was about power, and who dared to test it. Back in the room, the journalist shut off the camera. There was no grand goodbye, no firm handshake, just a quiet nod, an unspoken recognition that something much bigger than an interview had just happened. Jasmine stood, gathered her things, and looked back once, not to check her image on screen, but to make sure the record was left intact. She walked out into the late afternoon light. It was the kind of light that didn't flatter. It revealed. The sky was gray. The wind was dry. And yet something felt freshly broken open. Outside the building, 3 law students were waiting. None of them approached her. They didn't ask for autographs. They just watched her pass by, stunned, humbled. They had expected fire, but what they saw was something far more dangerous, a woman who burned without flame. In the days that followed, the quotes spread quietly, without press releases or campaigns. It wasn't trending on social media. It was being copied into legal memos, slipped into courtroom oral arguments, quoted at immigration rallies, not as protest, but as precedent. And that was the point. Jasmine had not spoken for applause. She had spoken for accountability. She had forced the system to face itself, not with screaming, but with one unforgiving mirror. That one sentence, measured, merciless, and unforgettable, would become the turning point not only of the hearing, but of how the law was taught, tested, and challenged. Not because it indicted a first lady, but because it reminded the country that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's complicity, and sometimes the only way to break it is to ask a question. What followed wasn't a scandal. It was awakening. When Jasmine asked aloud what most refused to even whisper, she didn't launch a protest. She exposed an echo chamber made for the powerful. In the phone booths and elevators of congressional buildings, in the hush of law school corridors, one sentence traveled faster than any headline. I didn't make noise. I just asked the one question people were too afraid to whisper. That line became a lesson in human dignity, more striking than any legal precedent. Professors printed it in bold on PowerPoint slides. Student newspapers reprinted it in teacher-student debates. In immigrant community forums, organizers spoke of how Jasmine's courage taught them that silence isn't neutrality. It can be complicity. Because the real lesson wasn't that laws were broken, but that some were allowed to stay silent while others were punished for the whisper of a typographical error. Legal clinics across the country started asking a new guiding question at intake interviews. Not just, do you qualify, but are you being treated the same as someone with power? Social justice attorneys said Jasmine didn't just fight one case, she changed the vocabulary of advocacy. No longer was the narrative about who broke the law, it became about who enforced it and under what light. Immigration law seminars shifted instantly from hypotheticals to history, and the Melania question became more than precedent. It became a mirror held up to every system made to see only select reflections. That lesson was seeping into ethics classes, where students were taught not just regulation, but responsibility. That power without introspection isn't strength, it's arrogance. Courts that once accepted envelope names without question began facing arguments rooted in fairness, not strategy. Jasmine's question wasn't about Melania's past. It was about the integrity of all futures. If laws were meant to protect people, then every voice must matter equally, not just the loudest, wealthiest, or most stylish. That's what lessons are built to change. More teachers began assigning her quote as mandatory reading, not for inspiration, but instruction. They asked, how do you defend someone who's been labeled un-American for asking what every citizen should ask? Why? Why does it matter who asks? When law students debated whether to defend organizational clients or individuals, they considered that question as a tiebreaker. If a rule isn't applied equally, then every administration of that rule becomes subjective. As one professor stated in a faculty meeting, policy without parity is just politics clothed in procedure. Jasmine's lesson reached deeper than law. It reached conscience. Community centers served as unofficial translators for her question. One Illinois pastor wrote a sermon titled, "When the Silence Speaks Truth." He didn't quote legal lines. He told stories. It wasn't Melania's name that mattered. It was the mother deported over a zip code, the teen detained after a traffic stop, the child removed for paperwork litany. All were now connected by the same question. Who decides which mistakes are criminal and which are forgiven? By spring, the phrase had turned into a diagnostic tool for fairness. Where a case was being heard, people asked, will the person in the dock have the same privileges as the person casting the stones? Clinical psychologists spoke of the Melania effect. When people saw that mistakes were tolerated for some and weaponized against others, they questioned the narrative of merit. And in the departments of political science, scholars reevaluated legal legitimacy by assessing who got to rewrite history and whose history was washed away. It wasn't just a lesson, it was a reckoning. Because Jasmine didn't ask them to notice injustice. She forced them to feel it. She tore open the idea that America applies one rule for all. Instead, she made them see it applies one rule for most and another for those with influence. That fractured promise is what she sought to challenge. In documentary forums, activists quoted that line, and not because it sounded good, because when someone dared to stay silent in a loud room, they forced everyone else to speak. That is what she meant by not making noise, not appearing in headlines. She refused to spectacle. She insisted on substance. And the systems that rely on spectacle were far more shaken than she ever was. Jasmine didn't make noise. She disrupted narrative by being direct. And by the end of that week, attorneys were no longer debating whether to file forms. They were asking, who does the form protect and who punishes it? That is the lesson the law school classrooms can teach, not just the legal codes. It is in the struggle between enforcement and empathy, and that struggle became real for everyone who listened. Ultimately, her lesson didn't fade with the scandal. It deepened into conviction. People didn't just remember the question, they began asking their own. Why does the law allow discretion for some and discipline for others? What makes one life less lawful than another? Jasmine forced not answers, but accountability. And in that accountability, justice had a chance to breathe again. That is the human lesson, not loud, not theatrical, but unrelenting. For in justice, you don't need sound, you need truth. And Jasmine's quiet courage reminded the nation how deeply that truth matters. Long after the chamber emptied and the microphones were turned off, her final words lingered. Not because they were loud, but because they cut through everything that tried to silence them. Jasmine didn't leave behind outrage or scandal. She left behind a question that refused to die. It spread not through media headlines or cable news shoutfests, but in the quiet spaces where people think harder. Law school classrooms, immigrant shelters, courthouse elevators, late-night study sessions. Her message wasn't thunder, it was pressure, and pressure, when applied in the right place, shifts entire tectonic plates. What she said wasn't meant to tear down any one person. It was meant to expose a system built on selective blindness. When she spoke about Melania, she wasn't attacking a woman. She was asking why justice had become so allergic to consistency. And that question, who gets punished for what, was louder than any accusation. Professors across the country began rewriting their syllabi. They didn't just teach about immigration pathways or legal loopholes. They taught about power. One case study read, Melania K., an analysis of discretion in high-profile immigration. Students debated not whether she had committed a violation, but why her violation was massaged, buried, and redefined as patriotism. Jasmine's point was never that Melania didn't belong. It was that if she belonged, so did the thousands deported for less. If one woman could work without a permit and become First Lady, why couldn't a housekeeper work a third shift without being caged and deported? And if that question made people uncomfortable, then maybe the discomfort wasn't Jasmine's fault. Maybe it was the system's mirror showing its cracks. In interviews, Jasmine never gloated. She didn't parade herself as a hero or a martyr. When asked if she regretted exposing what she did, her answer was disarmingly simple. I didn't make noise. I just asked a question when everyone else tried to stay quiet. That line became more than a quote. It became a lens. A professor at Columbia Law wrote it on the board every Monday. A nonprofit leader in Phoenix tattooed it on her forearm. A teenager in El Paso made it her senior yearbook caption. It echoed because it didn't scream. It whispered something most Americans had felt but hadn't named. The laws don't protect everyone the same. And when someone says that out loud, the silence around them isn't shame. It's fear. This wasn't just about immigration. It was about everything. It was about the intern who was fired for being late one morning, while a CEO got a bonus for bankrupting a company. It was about the black teenager tackled for shoplifting, while billionaires rewrote tax codes in private jets. It was about the janitor who filled out the wrong form and lost a job, while a politician's daughter got a passport with one phone call. Jasmine's story wasn't confined to the Capitol. It became the undercurrent of a larger awakening. She'd lit a match, but the gas had been there for years. And the fire didn't burn down institutions. It burned through excuses. The most powerful part? She didn't shout. She didn't call names. She didn't weaponize humiliation. Jasmine Crockett did something much more dangerous to the powerful. She told the truth so plainly, they couldn't discredit it without discrediting themselves. That's what made her dangerous. Not her voice, but her clarity. Her refusal to bend the truth to fit the comfort of those in charge. She brought receipts. She brought dates. She brought silence. The kind that follows after a room full of people realize they've been complicit by omission. And she did it all without raising her voice. Young attorneys began citing her hearings as precedent, not in court, but in courage. They stopped apologizing for defending the vulnerable. They stopped whispering their truth behind closed doors. Jasmine's stand had shown them that it was possible to speak hard truths without being cruel, to challenge injustice without needing to dress it up in hashtags or headlines. She made justice human again, Messy, contradictory, emotional, but human. And in that humanity was the key. The law isn't supposed to be a shield for the rich and a sword against the poor. It's supposed to be a promise. Jasmine reminded the country what that promise sounds like when someone finally stops pretending it was ever fulfilled. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.